So in this part, we want to talk specifically about working with fonts and a few of the different styles that you can apply to fonts to control how they look. So we'll go through each of those kind of in turn. The first thing we want to talk about is how to configure the font family. So the font family says, it's also sometimes known as the font face. This is how we kind of change what font is shown. So there's a few generic font families in CSS that are kind of general groupings of fonts. So we have serif fonts, first of all. And those, that would be, say, Times New Roman would be an example of that, which is the default font for most web browsers. And the reason we call it serif is it's got these little, all these little bits and pieces on the kind of the corners, right? We call those serifs. So if you zoom in on those, you can kind of see that those are there. On the other side, we've got what we call sans serif fonts. And that just means that fonts that don't have serifs, right? So Times New Roman has serifs, Arial does not. So you'll notice on things like the T's, it's got those little bars here, but it doesn't have those things on the T's, little tilde on the bottom of some of those. So that's kind of what the difference there is. In general, serif fonts are good for printing and reading things on a printed page, versus sans serif fonts are more preferred for digital media, for reading on a screen. So most websites that are out there on the internet, most websites will stick to a sans serif font. For the large part, because it's just easier to read. There's also monospace fonts. Monospace fonts make the width of every character is the same. Like in other fonts, you can see that the width of the characters vary. So like an I is a very narrow character, an M is a much wider character. But with a monospace font, every character takes up the same amount of space, takes up the same amount of width. And that's helpful when we're working with, say, code examples to get things to line up. So typically anytime we're looking at code, whether it be in Visual Studio or whatever IDE or text editor that you're using, or if we're just showing it as an example, code we typically put in a monospace font. There's also cursive and fantasy fonts, which look like so, but really we never use. Those are simply because they're so hard to read. Those are very infrequently used at all on websites. And if you do use them at all, they should be sparing, such as only using them for titles or headers and nothing else. Simply, again, because they're much harder to read, so you don't want to put the main text of your website in either in any of those. So that's the generic families, and every browser has those. You can say set the font to that for any browser, and it will automatically go and pick a font that is in that group, is in that family. So for instance, if you say that the font is serif, it'll generally default that to Times New Roman. If you say that the font is sans serif, it will probably default that to Arial. If you set the font to cursive, it will probably default it to Lucida handwriting. It may be different depending on the specific operating system and browser, or if you say fantasy, it will probably be Impact as the default font there. Okay, so the way we specify that in CSS is with the font family attribute, and you'll notice there's a dash in there. So anytime you see and you may have noticed this as we've been going through, but anytime you see a CSS property that's got more than one word in it, those are not separated as camel case, they're separated with dashes. So dashes is how we separate those words. So font family is set to Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. So the way this works is not every browser is going to have maybe Arial, maybe not every browser is going to have Helvetica. So you say, what font would you like to use? And I'll use that one if I have it, but if I don't have that one, give me one to fall back to. So if it has Arial, it's going to use Arial. If it doesn't have Arial, then it's going to use Helvetica. And if it doesn't have either of those two, then it will fall back and use the default sans serif font, which would then be something else. So anytime you specify a font, you should always provide a fallback, and always in there is the last option in here. The last one should be one of these generic font families. So you always find out, like, okay, this font I want to use is a sans serif font, so therefore it should fall back to sans serif. This is a serif font, so we should fall back to serif, etc. So you always want to know when you're using a font, you want to specify that fallback. Otherwise, if you don't specify a fallback, it's going to fall back to Times New Roman, which oftentimes is not going to make your website look very pretty. So make sure anytime you're specifying a font, always provide a font family, generic font family to allow it to fall back to. So same way here, Times New Roman or Times or serif or Courier New, Courier, monospace. So you'll notice that both of these, Times New Roman and Courier New, that there's quotes around them. You can either be double quotes or single quotes. You do have to put those quotes in if your font name has more than has spaces in it. If it's got spaces, you do have to put quotes, but if there's no spaces in it, you do not have to put quotes. Okay. You can also adjust the font size using any of the measurements that we talked about in the previous video, whether that be pixels, whether that be points, or whether that be font sizes or EMs. Again, my recommendation from the last video was that your root font size, the font size you applied to the HTML element, should be specified in pixels. Could be points, but pixels are points. And then all the fonts beneath that, everything else should be in EM or REMs. You want to do root EM units. So these are different ways to specify the size of the font. Okay. Yeah, so it will fall back. If it gets down to the last one and it can't, because it can't find the others, it'll use the default font for that family. And another thing to know as you're working with all these font properties, most properties are not, in CSS, are not inherited by the elements that are descendants. However, the font properties are. So if I say that the main has this font family, font size, etc., if I apply that font styling to main, then anything but inside main will inherit that those font properties as well. So just be aware of that as we go through, that all of these follow that rule. So let's say I want to apply a font and a font size to body. It might look something like this. I would say, okay, I want to set the font to Arial. If you don't have Arial, use Helvetica or then sans serif. So that's your font family, and set that just 100%. Wherever the current font size is, just keep it at that. And this effectively, setting the font size to 100% basically does nothing unless it's already been set by the browser's default styling or some of your other rules. That would just unset it or set it back to what it was originally. For working with, if you wanted to say things that are further down in there in descendants, so for instance, let's say the P tags, well, maybe we want to change all the paragraph tags to Times New Roman. Okay, well, I could do that, but they would still keep the same font size. They would still keep the 100% font size because I haven't changed that. Some other properties that I can set are the font style. So the font style determines how slanted the font is. So that can either be normal, where it's not slanted, or it could be italic, or it could be oblique. If I remember right, oblique is a little bit more slanted than italic. So you can do either of those. Some fonts don't have, per se, an italic style. So some fonts you may have to use oblique to get it to actually be slanted. For the font weight can be specified in a few different ways. Normal with keywords, which would be like normal, bold, and then bolder or lighter. You can use any of those to specify how bold it is, or you can use a number. So the numbers go from 100 to 900, and they're in multiples of 100. So 100, 200, 300, etc. And if I remember right, per the textbook, 400 is your normal, and I think 700 is your bold, is your typical bold. So if you use the word normal, you're setting the font weight to 400, and if you're setting it to bold, you're typically setting it to 700. But you can make it up or down from there. The keywords bolder and lighter are relative to the font that's inherited. So if it's already at say 500, then bolder is going to make it maybe 600, make it another step. And then if you say lighter would be a lower step, would be less bold. There's also font variant. You can read up here about what all those different settings are, because there actually are quite a few more font variant options than really your textbook discusses. So, and some of those, that's just because it's new. So historically, there were two options with that. Either you had normal, which is the default, or font variant small caps, which would make it kind of look like this, where all the letters are capital, except that ones that are actually capital are a little bit bigger. So that's one font variant, but there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do with font variant. We won't spend too much time on that, but if you want to read up further on that, on font variant, you can follow through the MDN article about that. The line height is a pretty important setting. The line height says what's the vertical distance of a line of text. So if you wanted to do like single line spacing, that would just be 1.0, or if you wanted to do 1.5, that would be a line and a half, or double spaced text would be 2. You may have heard about that in your English classes. For instance, a lot of English classes ask you to do double spaced when you write your English papers. Well, this is how you control things like that. Control the line height. Okay. So some examples of working with these different font properties. So say I want to make it italic, I could write it like that. Or if I want to say, well, it's already got some italic on it and I want to remove that, I could say font style normal, and that would put it back to normal styling. If I wanted to specify the small caps, I can do that there, or font variant small caps. If I want to specify weights, I can do it with a number, like so, 700, or I could say bold or normal. As I said, bold is 700, so that's mostly bold. You remember, it can go all the way up to 900, so it can actually be a little bit bolder than that. And then 400 be your normal, so you could step that down to like 300, 200, 100 if you wanted to not be at, if you wanted the text to be a little bit lighter. So that's that. Line heights you can specify using any of those measurement units that we have talked about before, or just straight up a multiplier. So here we can say 14 point as the height, or I could say in pixels. I can also specify it as a percentage, so I can say 140% of the current font size. So that means that there's, if we say that 100% is the size of the line, the actual text, then 40% of that would get divvied up between the above and below that line to create space between between the lines. So that means about 20% above, 20% below. You can also specify those percentages. You can specify them using EMs or REMs. EM is going to be the exact same thing as a percentage, or you can just say 1.4. And 1.4 is equivalent to 140% or 1.4 EM. So either any of these options here, just a multiplier with no unit, or having it as an EM or having it as percentage, all of those are valid for line heights. Probably the easiest option to use for line height is going to be to just use this multiplier here without a unit. I'd say definitely. So there also is a shorthand property for font. Rather than setting each of these one by one, which sometimes can be a little bit cumbersome, you can set them all at once. Now, do be forewarned that once you set them all together with this font, you can't say pick and choose and say set some things but not other things. If you use the shorthand font property, then you are setting everything to the value you specify or to the default value. So it overrides all of these properties whether or not you use them. So just be aware of that. So if you're only changing one or two properties, it's still better to use, like if you just want to change the font family, then just use font family. But if you want to change all of these at once, then using the font property can help. So it can start, first thing is the style, the weight, the variant, and then it can be size and line height and family. So they do have to be in this order. If you're going to specify them. But notice the ones in the brackets, those ones in the brackets are optional. You don't have to include them, but you do always have to include a size and a family for the font property. So for example, we've got a few ones here. We've got, okay, so it's going to be italic, bold, 14 pixels is the size of the font, so it's going to be 14 pixels tall, and then the actual lines are going to be 19. So we'll have 5 pixels divvied up between the top and bottom that are used for spacing the lines apart. It'll be Arial and sans serif. So that's how that might look. Similarly, you've got small caps. 150% would be the size of the font, times New Roman, times serif, that would all be the family. If I'm looking at this line, 90% is the size of the font, 120% is the line height, and then it's Comic Sans impact, sans serif. So that's how that might fall out. You can again use this as a shorthand in some cases. Okay. Other properties that we can use, first off is text indentation, and text indentation will change. We provide a measurement that says how far we want the first line indented. So text indent does not indent the entire paragraph, it only indents that first line. Text alignment can change where it is, where the text is horizontally, either left, center, or right. Now, one thing to know that this really only works with text. Okay, we talked about earlier in the first week. We talked about there's this idea that there are block elements and there are inline elements. Well, these text alignment and vertical alignment properties that we're talking about here, these do not work with block elements. We have to use different tools to align block elements. So do be aware of that. If you try to use these for alignment, they will not work for anything that's a block. They only work for text. We can align it left, center, or right. There are some other options in here too. Same thing. So with the vertical alignment, we can align the text either bottom, middle, baseline using those keywords. And those are basically what you would expect. Middle and baseline are generally pretty close, but there are some differences. So with text, note that there are some characters that kind of go above the line and some that go below the line, what we call the baseline. such as G's and P's, have a little line that goes beneath the baseline. Well, if you're using that, using text where some of the text goes above the baseline and some doesn't, middle alignment can cause some weird oddities, whereas baseline makes sure that the baseline of the text is what you're aligning. So there are some interesting offsets that you can get where sometimes middle alignment is what you want, sometimes baseline alignment. I'd say more often than not, baseline is usually a better choice over middle alignment when you're trying to get those things. But it really depends on situation. If you're trying to align middle text in the middle with other things, then middle can be usually better. But if you're trying to align text with other text, then baseline is usually better. Text decoration. There's a few different options that we can use there. The key one that you'll see is underline. So if you want to make text underlined, you use text decoration for that. But you can also add, say, overline, which puts a line above, or you can use strike through, line through, which also known as strike through, puts a line through it. Or you can say none, which is the default and means that there's no decoration, there's no line. So a lot of times we'll use underline for links to call them out as links to the user. Okay. If we want to look at an example page here, let me pull this up in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open folder. Let's go over to Book Examples, Chapter 4. Okay, Book Examples, Chapter 4, and this is example 14. So open with Live Server. So here we've got a few examples. So we've got some basic text. We've got a header, we've got a main, and we've got a footer. And there's H1 in the header, and then paragraphs in main and footer. So the CSS that we're going to apply to this, we'll apply some CSS to the body as a whole. So we're going to set the font size as just 100%. There's some basic margin, 2 EM, and that's being used to create space over on the left, the top, and the right side. There's also space on the bottom, but you can't really see that underneath here. H1, we're saying the font size. You can see the font's bigger, and that's our 180%. We've got some text indent going on this paragraph, and that's where you can see that it's normally would be here, but it's actually over there. If I inspect the element, that may be a little bit clearer. So if I look at here, you can kind of see the blue outlines where it actually is, but you can see that first line is indented by the amount that we picked, by 2 EM. So I could uncheck that and you would come back. So remember, text indent is just for that first line. Next we can look at the footer paragraph. We can see a few things that are happening there. We can see the text alignment and the font size. So if I inspect that, turn that off and on, you can see if I turn the font size off, it's regularly sized. Usually you want your copyright information a little bit smaller because you don't necessarily need to draw everybody's eye to it. So we're going to make that 80%, and you can see that it's right aligned. The default would be left aligned. So that's what we're doing there. Back to the slides. So let's talk a little bit about shadow. So shadow is another thing we can apply to text. It requires a few properties to set up. So the first one is the horizontal offset. The second one is the vertical offset. Third is being the blur radius, or how blurred is it, and then the color of the shadow. Okay, and this can be used. We kind of, if you've heard the term drop shadow, this is how we apply this. This is a relatively newer feature added in CSS3. but most browsers support it nowadays, so you can use it pretty safely. What it does is it adds an additional sort of shadow is the idea. You can kind of see that if we look at this example, we've got a text shadow where we've just specified the horizontal and the vertical offset as 4 pixels. Well, because we haven't specified the color, it's showing up at the same color as the text, which doesn't really help, makes it kind of hard to read the text. So you usually want to specify, you should always specify a color to go with this shadow. So we've got the shadow, same color as the text. We haven't specified how to blur it, so it's not blurred. But you can see with 4 pixels to the 4 pixels to the right, 4 pixels down, you can see that it's there's kind of 2 copies of it showing there. If I change things up a little bit, I can use this to maybe make the text pop a little bit more. So in this example, I made the color blue. So we've got blue text to start with, and then I've applied a text shadow. I said -2, -2. So it's 2 pixels to the left of the original text and 2 pixels up is our shadow. Then we've applied a blur of 4 pixels, so you can see that it's just a little bit blurred, just a little bit faint. That's a good number. Generally speaking, the larger your text, the larger your font size is, the more you need to blur it, and the smaller your font size is, the less you need to blur it. Same thing with the offset. The larger it, the farther your offset is away, kind of creates an impression that the text is farther away from the surface. The distance between the text and the paper is farther the bigger your offset is. So a small offset makes it look like it's pretty close to the text. So we usually stick with pretty small offsets. So -2, -2, we'll push it up and left instead of down and to the right. Give it a blur, and you can see it's red. So general rules for accessibility. You want to make sure as you're adding shadows that you're really considering visual impairment. As you saw with some of the previous 2 examples, if depending on how you use it, it can actually make the text harder to read. But if used properly, it can actually make it easier to read. So this would be a really good example here where we've got yellow text with a nice faint black border, black shadow behind it. So that actually makes the text easier to read than without it. So yay. So just things to keep in mind. Make sure that you're not using too much shadow around the page. Typically the only things that we're going to put shadow on will be like headers or text that is on top of images. We typically don't want to use this with the main body text of the page. This is just for, again, headers or text that is on top of images. Too much blur, too much shadow can make things harder to read, so use it sparingly, keep the blur numbers low. Generally speaking, you want to keep your shadows dark and preferably black. Again, because of the shadow, if it's not black, it's kind of like going against to what it's trying to simulate. Because shadows in the real world, they're black, or they're dark colored. And then another thing, just in terms of design, make sure that when you're adding shadows that you're consistent about the direction that it looks like the shadow is coming from. So if our shadow is down and to the right a bit of the text, that means that the light is coming from the top left. If that makes any sense. So if the light's coming this way, then the shadow's going to be coming that way as well. So you just want to be consistent and think about what the direction of the shadow says about the direction of the light. or vice versa. Think about where you think your light source should be, and that would dictate where your shadow should be. But if you say, well, some elements here it's down to the right and some elements down on the left, that can be a little bit disconcerting to people as they're reading it. So just try to be consistent with the direction that your shadows go. Sometimes you want to intermix text and images together. By default, text and images, they don't always flow the best. So oftentimes if you want to put text in them, if you want to put an image in the middle of text, you need to float it either to the left side of the page or the right side of the page. So here's an example of floating the image to the left. You're pulling it out of the main line of the text and sticking it to the left of the text. So the text gets kind of shoved to the right. Looking at the HTML for that would look a little bit something like this. So we've got an image, we've got an H1, and we've got an H2. So remember that image is going to be going to the left, and then the other two will go a little bit to the right. The CSS that we're actually applying is to the image. So we'll tell the image to float left, and then we'll give it a little bit of margin. Okay. Now, we're only talking a little bit about images here. In this chapter, we'll talk much more in further chapters about how to work with images and how to do some additional styling in how this floating works. But this is just kind of a very brief introduction to it. So we're floating it to left, giving it a little bit of margin. That margin creates the space between the image and the actual text. If I didn't say margin right, the image would get all the way next to it. I think if there's an example here. So it's 16. We can kind of play around with that. So open with live server. There we've got what it looks like right now. If I didn't have the margin there, you see how it would be right up next to, I need to switch it so you can actually see my screen. Sorry about that. Okay. So I've got the example pulled up, and here's that styling. So if I don't apply that margin right, there we go. So the text is right next to it. So typically if you're floating, you also need to apply some margin to the image so that things don't immediately then start butting up. The text doesn't immediately start bunching up with the image. So those things usually go together. So because we're floating left, the margin's on the right. If we were floating right, then we'd put the margin on the left. The other thing we're doing in here is we're also adding a clear. So a clear says stop floating. When you see that clear, that says stop floating. So you can clear on the left, which would only clear anything that's floating on the left. You could say clear right, that would only stop things on the right. Typically you're going to say clear both to stop things on both left and right. Okay, so in this chapter, I think we're mostly done. So let me pull that back. So if you go through Book Apps, the Town Hall example, you'll find some examples of how to do these things. I'll let you really explore that example on your own time, using all the stuff we've talked about in this chapter. It's got, if you're looking at it, you'll see that it's got some CSS applied. It's got the normalized CSS and then the main CSS style sheet. So I'll let you walk through that example on your own time, because there's enough there to kind of dig through and digest, and knowing all the things that we've covered in this chapter, you can kind of see where those things are and how they've applied some of those things, some of those pieces. Okay, so to just refresh on everything that we've covered here in chapter 4, at this point you should be able to take an HTML document and create a style sheet for. formatting it, using all the selectors and rules and styles and things that we've talked about here. Given an HTML document and some CSS, you should be able to use the developer tools, which we showed you how to do that in Chrome. It's basically the same with most browsers, with some minor differences. If you're looking at a selector for CSS, you should be able to say, okay, this applies to these kinds of elements. This is what this means. What elements would that apply to? What elements would that not apply to? We talked a bit about the 3 different ways to apply CSS, which was either as an external style sheet, an embedded style sheet, or as inline styles. We talked about why it's best to use to put most of your CSS in an external style sheet. There's more info about that and the reasoning behind that in the book. So definitely read through chapter 4 and you'll find some more information there. We talked a bit about the normalized CSS style sheet and why that's a really good thing to include in all of your projects. Mainly the point being standardizing things so that for cross-browser compatibility, because there are some minor differences between how their default CSS default style sheets are set up. So using normalize means that you have a lot less differences based on what browser you're using. We also talked about absolute measurements versus relative measurements and what does that mean. We talked about and then their definition of absolute is basically that it's not relative to any other styles or elements or elements that are on the page. It's like you say this is 14 pixels or 14 points, that's what it is, regardless of what other styles were previously applied. The rest of those measurements are typically relative for font sizes and such. We talked about the different ways to do CSS. We talked about those different types of selectors. The universal selector we talked about, which is just a star. We talked about the type, which is just you specify the kind of tag that you're working with. ID, remember, starts with a hash mark. Class selectors start with a dot. We talked about descendant selectors, which is you put in multiple selectors separated by a space. Child selector, or direct descendant, which is the greater than sign. We talked about sibling, which is either the adjacent sibling or general sibling. Adjacent sibling is a plus. General sibling is a tilde. We talked about pseudo classes. Remember, for links, we talked about link, the link, visited, hover, and focus. And remember, if you're applying hover or focus, you should apply both for accessibility. We talked a little bit about pseudo elements, namely first line and first letter are the 2 pseudo elements we talked about here. We talked a little bit about those accessibility guidelines. We talked about using the important. You can use important to override rules that are already there, whether it be from your CSS or somebody else's CSS style sheet that they've written, whether it's a theme you're using or your own, as well as overriding style sheets that are already built into the browser. We talked about using a few different properties to style fonts from the font family and talking about the generic font families and the way they fall back. We talked about font style, font weight, font size, and line height. And then we also talked about briefly about some other ones, namely the text indent and text alignment, text decoration, and text shadow. So at this point, that puts us at the end of chapter 4. You should be good to go complete the reading assignments on perusal, as well as the lab and homework assignments on Inside Riken. So that's it for chapter 4. and then I'll see you again later for probably tomorrow for chapter 5. All right. Thank you.